What would you say and do if you're driving down the road, you all of a sudden see a barrier in the roadway, then you see cops standing around and you realize you've come up on a DWI checkpoint? In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to handle the cops during a DWI checkpoint and what you can do if the cops decide they're going to arrest you. Currently, 38 states and the District of Columbia allow cops to set up roadblocks in order for them to stop your car and walk up to you to try to see if they can figure out if you've had something to drink. Are these checkpoints legal? Yes, they are. Even though I disagree with the Supreme Court on this issue, the Supreme Court case of Michigan versus Sitz clearly establishes that police are allowed to set up these roadblocks for DWI checkpoints unless you live in one of the states that has passed a law ruling these to be illegal, just like Texas did. So that begs the question, if you happen to live in one of these 38 states where DWI checkpoints are legal, what do you do and what do you say? Tip number 1, turn around before you get to the checkpoint. Look, if you see the checkpoint coming and you realize that it's a DWI checkpoint, you're allowed to make any type of traffic maneuver on the street you're on as long as it's legal. So if you're able to turn around legally and not commit a traffic violation, turn around and avoid the entire situation. Now, if the cops at the checkpoint see that you're doing a U-turn in order to avoid them, don't be surprised if they send one of their officers to try to tail you to look and see if they can find any ticky-tack reason that you've committed a traffic violation, so then they will be able to investigate you anyway. But if you make it to the roadblock and they approach, you need to understand something. You are now being detained. You cannot just keep driving and drive right by the roadblock. Tip number 2, don't be a jerk. I know this sounds like an obvious point, but I see this happen all the time. Someone will get very upset with the police officer, so in the process of exercising their rights, they will do it in a way where they're poking the bear with the police. If a police officer walks up to your window during a DWI checkpoint, and the first thing you say is, "Officer, I want you to realize you're being recorded right now, and I need to know why you're not going to let me pass through." If you say something along those lines, get ready because I've seen this happen. The officer, even if it's a so-called nice cop, they are now going to ratchet up the tension, and now you're going to have anything but a routine DWI checkpoint. It's always good to exercise your rights, but when a police officer walks up to your window during a DWI checkpoint, the best thing to do is to partially roll your window down and don't say anything. Let the officer speak first. You can be polite, you can be even-tempered, and there's no reason at all to raise your voice. But can you refuse to roll down your window here? First of all, be careful here. We need to remember that cops are allowed to run these DWI checkpoints. And if you refuse to roll down your window, even a little bit, you are now going to give an officer a reason and an excuse to escalate the situation. Do you have to roll your window all the way down? No, not necessarily, but you do need to roll it down far enough to do the next thing we're going to cover, which is, legally, cops are going to ask you for your driver's license and your insurance. In every single state, cops are allowed to ask you legally for a copy of your driver's license and then determine that you have valid insurance in order to operate the vehicle. So there's no reason at all to argue with the police when they ask this question, otherwise it will escalate the situation. So generally speaking, the best thing to do is to hand the officer your driver's license and your insurance and don't argue with him. You say, "Jeff, come on, what if the cops are just being rude or mean, or they're not really treating me the right way under my constitutional rights?" Just understand, if you begin to argue with the police officers in this particular situation, they are trained to take everything that you say and do and translate it into a sign of intoxication. So the moment you begin to argue, what they're going to say is that you became combative. And this is consistent with someone who has been drinking too much alcohol. So they'll use that as a reason to get you out of the car and now try to require you to perform some type of field sobriety test. Always remember, everything you say and do is going to be seen as a possible sign of intoxication by the police officer during the investigation. This leads me to my next tip. Tip number 3, don't talk so much. The moment a police officer walks up to your window during a DWI checkpoint, there's one thing you can count on: questions, and lots of questions. Cops are trained to do this because their primary goal whenever they walk up to your window on a DUI checkpoint is to establish probable cause to arrest you. The quickest way for them to develop this probable cause is for you to start talking. The more you talk and the more you ramble on, the more they can claim now they think they smelled an odor of an alcoholic beverage on your breath. And you know what? When you use that certain word, it sounded to me like you were slurring your speech, and you seemed to be a little confused when I asked you for your driver's license and insurance. But wait a minute, don't cops have to read me my rights before they start asking me questions during a DUI checkpoint? No, they don't. DUI checkpoints are not considered custodial interrogations. So as a result of that, the police officer does not have to read you your rights. That means everything you say can and will be used against you, so keep your mouth shut and be careful how much you interact with the police. Instead, after you provide a copy of your driver's license and your insurance, you can simply tell the officer that you're choosing to exercise your right to remain silent. You don't have to engage in small talk with the police during a DUI checkpoint because you have to realize in reality they are only fishing for you to give them any information, any evidence that they can use to further their DWI investigation. You can always be polite to the officer, but you should very clearly tell the officer you are exercising your right to remain silent and you will only answer his questions if a lawyer is present. Then shut your mouth. Why do I have to actually tell the officer that I want to remain silent? I know this seems weird and it's strange, but the Supreme Court has said if you want to exercise your right to remain silent, you have to actually tell the officer that you want to remain silent. Otherwise, the cops can actually use your silence against you. But wait, if I don't talk to the cops more, won't they just keep me on the side of the road for as long as they want? No. In fact, the Supreme Court has been very clear that police can only detain you for the reasonable amount of time necessary in order to complete the reason they're talking to you to begin with. In this case, a DUI checkpoint. Plus, if the cops continue to hold you for longer than is deemed reasonable, now you can actually have a basis to have anything they discover after this thrown out in court through a motion to suppress. Tip number 4, don't make sudden movements and always keep your hands where cops can see them. Always keep your hands visible by keeping them on the steering wheel and never make any sudden movements. If police ask you for your driver's license and insurance, it's really important to tell the officer what you're doing. In that situation, I would tell the officer, "Officer, I'm reaching into my back pocket in order to grab my wallet for my driver's license." Or maybe you can say, "Officer, I'm reaching over to my glove box to grab my proof of insurance." Don't move too quick because otherwise you're going to freak out the cops. Cops will now claim they thought you were making furtive movements and they thought you were reaching for a weapon. And they will now use this as an excuse to get you out of the car and perform a search not only on you, but also your vehicle. This routinely leads to officers saying, "Hey man, when I was digging around in your car, I thought I smelled a little pot. Or maybe I smelled the odor of an alcoholic beverage. I'm now going to need you to perform some sobriety tests here on the side of the road to make sure you're safe to drive." But wait, if the cops ask me to step out of my car, can't I just refuse? Unfortunately, no. Cops have relied upon the Supreme Court case of Pennsylvania versus Mims for nearly 50 years to require drivers of vehicles to step out of their car in order to conduct a pat-down search in the name of officer safety. So, don't fight the officer if he asks you to do this. This is also the reason I tell people to be careful refusing to roll down your window when an officer asks you to do so. Why? Because cops will now use this as an excuse to say your behavior made them in fear for their officer safety, and they'll use it as an excuse to force you out of the car for a full investigation. So, if cops ask you to step out of the car for an investigation, simply step out of the car, and this leads me to my final tip. Tip number 5, exercise all of your constitutional rights. If the officer asks you to step out of the car, remember you still have the right to remain silent. So, politely tell the officer, "I exercise my right to remain silent," then remain silent. Don't fall for the trick of answering police questions. You also have a right to refuse to take roadside sobriety tests. You can always refuse roadside sobriety tests. Now, it is true that in most states, your driver's license could be suspended for refusing to take some of these tests. But in my experience, refusing to take sobriety tests that are very hard, and many sober people fail them, and they are designed to allow nervous sober people to fail them, doesn't seem like it's in your best interest when your freedom is at stake. So what do you say if the officer keeps pressing you to take these roadside sobriety tests? Simply say that you would be happy to consider them after you consult with your attorney, because you don't know your rights. Now, I've seen some cops tell people in that moment while they're being recorded that they don't have a right to an attorney. And many juries just don't like that when a cop's trying to tell someone they have no right to speak to an attorney. So you can absolutely say that you're happy to cooperate after you've consulted with an attorney, and until then you're going to exercise your right to remain silent and then be quiet. You also have a right to refuse to take breath, blood, or urine tests. If the officer demands that you take a breath or blood test, you can absolutely refuse to consent. And that would now require that officer to establish a search warrant affidavit sufficient with evidence to convince a judge to sign off on it to draw your blood. Finally, you always have the right to counsel, particularly if they arrest you. If an officer has now decided they're going to arrest you for DWI, it's important to realize that nothing you say or do is going to be able to allow you to get out of the situation. So the best thing to do is exercise your right under the Sixth Amendment to counsel and exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and fight this case in court, not on the roadside. Finally, look, if you make it through this DWI checkpoint and the cops tell you that you're free to leave, leave. I've seen so many police encounters where the citizen has actually won the encounter with the officer and now they're free to leave, only for them to turn around and say, "What is your badge number? Who did you say you were? What's the name of your supervisor?" And then they begin to argue with them about how they were treated. By doing this, you have now converted what was a detention where you were not free to leave into a consensual encounter where you continue to now volunteer information to the police. The more you talk, the more the cops may now find what they think is new evidence, and this may now allow them to claim they can establish a new detention. This new detention could now lead to you being arrested because the cops didn't like something about your demeanor, your attitude, or any other factor that they may claim now gives them probable cause to make an arrest. So, what are the action points here? Number 1, have your license, insurance, and registration ready. Number 2, crack your window. Number 3, hand all the paperwork over to the cop. Number 4, be polite and professional. Finally, number 5, exercise your right to remain silent, then remain silent. Now, what if a cop walks up to your window and accuses you of DWI, but you weren't even driving? Maybe you were sleeping it off. Check out this next video where I cover 5 new tricks cops are using during DWI stops. See you over there.